Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It does tell me that I am screen sharing, so I hope it's being accurate.
You are.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to the River Management Society for the invitation to participate today, and thanks to you all that are participating in this session. I'm Allysia Angus, landscape architect with BLM. I've worked my whole career in Southern Utah in the landscapes of Grand Staircase, Escalante National Monument mostly. So you will see that a lot of my slides are very different landscape types than what those of you that are on the eastern side of the country deal with. So I will be sharing with you how BLM does impact analysis to our visual resources. And just a kind of a quick reminder, BLM developed a visual resource management system decades ago in response to our legal obligations under the National Environmental Policy Act, as well as under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, both of which direct us to manage our scenic resources. So the system that we developed in BLM to manage visual resources has three primary components. One is the inventory, understanding what we have. The next is establishing our management objectives and our land use planning efforts. So we determine how we're going to manage what we have, and then the active management of that resource. Are we, with the projects that are implemented on public lands, are they meeting the objectives that we set? And so we use this tool, the contrast rating analysis tool, to determine whether or not we're meeting those objectives. And it also helps us get toward that meeting of on the project by project basis. BLM's contrast rating process is described in one of our handbooks, and it is our primary tool for determining impact analysis. And as I already mentioned, it also allows us to determine whether or not we're meeting what we said we would do in our land use plans. There are several steps in the contrast rating process, and through the presentation, I will be going through all of these. I'm also, as I go through them, going to use a fairly simple project that consistently threads through to help, share this story. But be mindful that the process is also applicable across much larger and much more complex projects. So the first step in the contrast rating process is to obtain a complete project description, right? It's imperative that we understand what our project details are if we're going to be able to determine what visual effects it may create. In the case of the sample project that we're going to use, this is a project that I was involved in a few years ago here. It's the development of a parking area, restroom facility, and other items associated with basically a recreational development. The project is at Dance Hall Rock, which is a designated National Historic Site, and it has been through time used by the public in a user-created way. The lower image shows you kind of the area where it was being used for parking, though with like a spin on how we clean that up. And then the upper image is the concept associated with moving the parking to a different location, but still in proximity to the site. There on the left, I've kind of detailed what the various components of the project were. And the thing to be mindful of is that the alternative B in this example has an additional element of reclamation of the existing disturbed area if that is the one that we select. The next step in the contrast rating process is to turn to our land use plan for a particular area and understand what our objectives are for this particular space. So the blue dot on the graphic at the lower right of the screen shows you, it's a screen capture of GIS. And so this project falls within that limey green color, which is a VRM class 2 location. And at the top of the screen, I've kind of gone through what the various aspects of management are associated to VRM class 2 for BLM. and they are that we want to retain the existing landscape character. The changes that could be allowed should be low, and that we're seeking for our activities not to attract the attention of our casual observers, as we call them. The projects can be seen, but they shouldn't be such that they're attracting your attention when you're traveling through the space. The next step in the contrast rating process is to then refer to our visual resource inventory so that we document and understand the values associated with this particular location. The image on the screen shows you another screen capture from GIS. The project location is still a blue dot. And in this location, it is in an inventoried area that is visual resource inventory class 2. And the components that build upon themselves to result in that class 2 are it's an area that has a scenic quality rating of a high B. We have an A, B, and C system in BLM. And so this one sits at the upper end of the B range. It's in a location that's highly sensitive to change based on a variety of characteristics, it being a historic site, being along a state historic trail, being next to a heavily used travel corridor for recreational access. That factored into its high sensitivity to change for the public. And then lastly, it is in the foreground, middle ground distance zone. It's right off the side of a primary travel corridor. The next step for us in the contrast rating process is to conduct a visibility analysis. And this can be done very simply or in a very complex fashion based on the project itself. The simple could be driving through an area and kind of just seeing how much you think of a simple project might be visible, or it could be very complicated for our large multi-jurisdictional projects like transmission lines and pipelines and the such. I have of late for particularly smaller scale projects, my go-to personally is using the viewshed analysis tool in Google Earth. That's what you'll see there in the lower image. It's our same project location, and off of actually, I picked the bigger feature in the project proposal, the vault toilet, and ran a viewshed so that I could see where that vault toilet would likely be seen. And you can see it does cross over the road in several locations. The upper image I threw in as a comparative, that is a visibility analysis for a pipeline project that runs about 100 miles. And this is actually running the seen and unseen, or well, the unseen and then the highly seen to lesser seen locations along a national scenic historic trail. The blue areas are unseen off of the trail corridor, and the dark red are highly seen, and then as they transition into pink, it's lesser seen. So this way we were able to overlay then the project elements and see which locations they fall within. Okay, the next step then in our contrast rating process is to select key observation points. And those are locations where we're going to conduct our analysis. They're locations where the project elements are either most visible by the most viewers or by critical viewers. These can be single points like trailheads, in our case, scenic overlooks, campgrounds, or they can be linear as along a road, along a river, along a trail. And the number of key observations that you point is very much based on the project that you're dealing with. In some instances, one is fine. In others, particularly like these multi-jurisdictional projects, you will have many of them. That pipeline project that I showed you, I believe we had close to 50 KOPs for it. And I would just say that accuracy in selecting your key observation points is really important, because if you don't do a good job of picking them, then it could really sway the results of your rating analysis. So for this Dance Hall Rock project, I had 3 KOPs. The first one is along, and 2 of them are linear. So one is along Hole in the Rock Road, traveling south. Number 2 is traveling north on the same road, going in the opposite direction. And then we had a spot location, which is actually the floor of the dance hall. This dance hall rock feature is something the Mormon pioneers used when they were doing one of their expeditions, and it was where they gathered to sing and dance and kind of elevate their spirits. And that dance floor is like a natural amphitheater in this big sandstone feature. So we put one of our key observation points right in the middle of the dance floor itself. So here's just a bit more so that you can now see, like you're on the ground plane, of what the views are from these KOPs. And the first one, again, traveling south on the dirt road that we're on, it also points out the 2 locations of where the projects would be located. The second KOP is that one from the south, looking back north toward the project. This one, you can see that feature that I spoke about, right? The big sandstone form there that's got that circular shape in it. And so the third KOP is actually us standing on that feature, then looking out. And as you can see in that image, the alternative B is the user created. And there's even a vehicle there that kind of helps us see that. Whereas for alternative A, it's actually hidden behind another landform. So the next step is then going through our variable factors list, and there's several of these, and we want to understand the influence that they have on our project, because they influence the planning, they influence the analysis, and they can influence the plan conformance. So in the planning, it helps us identify the better project locations and how to design the project. They may help us identify different alternatives than maybe what we first considered. Within the analysis, they definitely help us select our key observation points, and then they help us really understand how the observer or the visitor experience the contrast that may be created by the project. And we have to be mindful that the factors that weigh in on a project could make the difference in whether or not we meet our plan objectives. So we're going to go through each of these fairly quickly. At Dance Hall Rock, the first one that we'll talk about is the season of use. This is a project location that is visited for us primarily in the spring through the fall. In the winter, that road that I showed you can have fairly sketchy access issues. So we'd see most of our visitors through the other months of the year. This is important because I can think particularly of locations, say, that their visitor use is in the winter, like in our ski locations. So you'd think more so that you'd want to make sure that you were contemplating the contrast it would create in a landscape that's predominantly white. So that's one example of why we want to be mindful of season of use. 2 of the next variable factors are the relative size and scale and the spatial relationships. So with scale, like the project size and scale and how it relates to its surroundings are very important. In this case, we have fairly small scale project, a vault toilet, a parking area that's not that big, and then the intermittently parked vehicles. They really would be dwarfed in comparison to the scale of these geologic features that they're in proximity to. And then the spatial relationships, how does this project relate to the other objects that are in the landscape near to it? So is our project above and elevated? Is it above the horizon line? Is it down below in an obscured location? In the case of this project, our features are in close proximity to large sandstone objects, and then it's also in close proximity to the road, which is also important. Let's see, our next variable factor are our viewing distances. How far away are we when viewing the project, if it's built? And with this, right, we all, I think, understand that the further away we get from something, the less dominant it appears. And also kind of the colors can start melding together and become less contrasting. So in this instance, I'm actually fairly close into our viewing platforms. From the amphitheater, alternative B is like 300 feet away. And then the KOP where I've got the greatest distance is the one from the south traveling north. And then its distance to alternative A is about 1,200 feet. So in all instances, right, these are very, very much in the foreground. So if I don't make good choices in my design of this, they're definitely going to be fairly obvious. So related to the last variable factor is the length of time in view. The longer, right, that I can see something, the more I'm going to be able to pick out the contrast that it creates. Whereas if I'm traveling by something on the freeway and it's in my peripheral view for a few seconds, then that's a really, really different amount of contrast to discuss. So in the case of this project, the KOP1 and KOP2 are different ends of a broader linear KOP. And in this instance, driving through this area where the project would be visible takes about 60 seconds. But that's really different than the Dance Hall Rock location, because I'm there if I'm the visitor and I can spend as much time as I want. And we would guess that most visitors are there about 30 minutes, but they could be there in some instances. Some of our historic reenactments that take place there, right? Those folks are there for half a day or more. So that is how the influence of the length of time in view comes into play. The next variable factor is our angle of observation. The apparent scale of a project is reduced when it's seen from lower angles, whereas it's increased when it's seen from above. And this has somewhat to do with when I'm observer below, looking up, I can't see the ground disturbance. If I'm at level, depending on the vegetation that's around me, I will see less of the ground plane to sometimes maybe none of it, if I've got some vegetation also that's screening it. But if I'm in a position up above looking down, then I am likely to see all of the ground disturbance, as well as all the components associated with the project. So the images on the slide just kind of reiterate how this goes. So in KOP1, I'm predominantly at observer level. And so for alternative A, I'm going to be able to see some portions of the project, but with the vegetation, possibly not necessarily the parking area itself, but maybe the things that stick up vertically. Whereas for alternative B, it's in a depression, so I am likely not to see many of its features. For a KOP2, I'm slightly above, so now I'll creep up and be able to see a bit more of the ground plane. For Alt A, still Alt B is in a bit of a depression. But then when I'm on KOP3 and I'm on the dance floor itself, of the two that are visible to me that aren't screened, I can see now the whole ground surface associated with the potential development. Light conditions are something we should also factor into the mix. When something is front lit, it's often flattened because there's lack of shadow. If something is backlit, it's kind of all turned gray and silhouetted, so I stop being able to kind of see the details. And then if something is side lit, actually, which would be honestly our preference for doing a contrast rating, I can see the shadows and the contrasts are accentuated, so I can understand kind of more what the features might look like. I would say with this one, it really comes into play like when you're going to do your contrast rating. And if you went out at certain times of the day, you would have a different representation of what the project might appear to be. And definitely if you were producing visualizations, you would not want to be doing them like in a backlit situation. So there are three more variable factors. They didn't come into significant play with this project that I'm sharing with you, but we want to be mindful of them. One is recovery time. How long will it take for successful revegetation and reclamation to occur? And that's really different, right? Based on our different climatic and ecological circumstances. For us here, that can be very, very long. In a more temperate climate, it's probably much faster. Well, it's definitely much faster. So it's pretty common that a project is not going to meet the visual objectives immediately after construction. So we'll want to have a discussion about the short term and then the long term and what the project would actually look like after the recovery time. And, you know, in our case, in our projects, I try to be explicit about what the estimated recovery time is. If there are components of a project that are going to create movement, then we know that movement is very much an attention attractor. So things like windmills, other things could be steam coming out of certain projects, smoke plumes, even dust. You know, in recreational locations on non-paved surfaces, there can be a lot of dust that can be kicked up. And that would be something that you would want to note. And then the last one is atmospheric conditions. And I would say for me, I think mostly about this one also when I'm doing my rating, like, you know, it's typically very clear atmospheric conditions here, but we have been having some pretty horrific fire seasons the last few years. And there have been weeks on end where going outside, it was not clear at all. So I would want to make sure that I wasn't doing my contrast rating like during the middle of an active fire in the vicinity, because I'm not going to be able to kind of pick up on the details of the landscape or the proposed project under those circumstances. Okay, having made our way through then all the variable factors, we're returning back to the steps in the contrast rating process. And one of those, as Mark mentioned, is doing visualizations. And these can be such a benefit, whether they're done on, you know, paper with a little sketch, or whether they're done digitally. And right, these can run a full range of very, very fancy and complex and costing tens of thousands of dollars for complex projects, to something that's fairly simple, but then still helps us understand the story. And so I did not prepare visualizations for the Dance Hall Rock project under the assumption that gravel parking area is a little vault toilet and some parked vehicles or something that definitely my BLM colleagues as well as the public do understand quite well. But I've got some images that we use in the VRM course of an oil and gas development. And the first image on the left is of pre-construction. The middle image is the proposal as received from the proponent. And the image on the right is the result of sharing the middle image and going, I think we can do something better here that has less effect. And right, the project was resited. The road was aligned in a different way, and then consistent, appropriate environmental colors were used. I don't know how big this is showing up on some of your screen, but in that mitigated visualization, the project features are there kind of close. A few of them are sticking up over the horizon line on the far left side of the frame. And excuse my coughing. So step 8 in the process is actually for us filling out our contrast rating form. And so we will go through that here. So after the top part of the form, which includes things like location and dates and whatnot, then we move into the middle of it. And in the middle section, there is a gridded chart that we fill out. And we describe the landscape character. And we do that by breaking the landscape into its landform and water if present, and its vegetation, and then if there are structures. And then across each of those larger components, we break them into the landscape character elements and have a description of the form of the landform, the form of the vegetation, the lines of same, the colors, and then the textures. And then further down on the form, we use the exact same grid, but then do descriptors based on what the landscape character would be by adding the project that we're evaluating. And in this case, you see some sames all across the landform, like, right, the scale and the details of this project are not going to affect the landform. With the vegetation, there will be veg removed for the parking area, or it would be enlarged if we went with alternative B. And in that case, we're going to create some edges in the vegetation around that removal. But then we'd be adding a little boxy form for the toilet, and we'd be adding some lines associated with the edges of the parking and the driveway. And then we talk about the tones and the colors that we would use for the features themselves. And then, what type of change might there be by adding this project from a textural perspective. Then the bottom of the form is where we document the degree of contrast that is created. So those little boxes that I can't read, so I'm going to doubt that you all can read particularly easily either. But the boxes at the top or in the middle under the header that are a little bit grayed out, those are me taking what was on the last two slides and putting them side by side. So it's more about the visual of now I'm doing a comparative. So what did I have and what will I have if I build this project? And so as I go through these, those sames are easy, right? Those correlate to having no contrast, which was the case with the landform. And then within the vegetation, I noted that there would be some lines, and my judgment on that is that they're weak. And then the structures, we're going to add, a small toilet facility, flush to the ground, graveled parking area and road, and then some signs and whatnot. So in all those instances across the structural components, I have also flagged that they would create weak contrast. We also note here if we're doing short-term or long-term, like I mentioned with the recovery, and this is a project that didn't warrant doing both. The broader scale projects with a lot of reclamation obviously do. And BLM considers short-term up to 5 years, and then long-term beyond 5 years through the life of the project. So then the last step is determining whether or not we have met plan conformance with a particular project. And for a project in VRM class 2, I would be looking for the contrast that's created to be no higher than weak. So if we have things that are rated as none and weak, then I can go, yes, this project for visual resources can move forward and meet our plan compliance. So I am double checking. Okay, I think I do have enough time. I just double checked my clock there. That kind of is the real fast, quick and dirty of how the contrast rating process works for BLM. And what I wanted to finish up with is actually showing you this project constructed, so you can determine whether or not you thought I did an okay job in my analysis. So this is KOP1 traveling down that road again. I didn't take the photo in the exact location, and look, I've got a bunch of backlit stuff going on, but I don't know how many of you can pick out kind of where the project maybe is, but I'm going to help you out. That arrow now points at the top of the toilet. This is the southern view from KOP2 looking upward. Oh, and I should have said, we did pick going with alternative A and reclaiming the existing kind of parking area. And the backstory on that is the LDS, the Latter-day Saints Historic History Group came down. They were one of our stakeholders in this project, and they definitely shared a concern for people standing on the historic feature itself and looking out across a parking area with parked vehicles and a vault toilet. So that helped in our decision making about shifting the constructed location over to that area that's screened by the big landform. And I think you could already see that one, but there's the little red dot. And something that's also successful about this project is the parking area is shaped in a circle, and we retain the native vegetation in the middle. So it has an island. So it also breaks up that area that we cleared. This is the KOP up on the dance floor itself. I've got the arrow there just to show you, you have to kind of trust me that the project is back there. But that landform does a great job of screening. And one other aspect of the project then is the reclamation. Ooh, and I meant to edit parking. So the park area, but the parking area, these two red arrows show you where the driveway used to come in, and the one on the left is where the parking area was. And we feel like our contractor who built this project did a great job. And this was taken within a year of the project, and now we're probably 5+ years on. And I don't think that most people could even differentiate that there had ever been a disturbance in that area now. So that gets me to the slide that I just want to share for the non-BLM or non-Western landscape folks, if we have any of them on the call, that BLM does manage an incredible diversity of landscapes, from coastal to Badlands to, you know, the Sonoran Desert to the kind of country that I work in. And I'm, you know, it's an agency and land bases that I'm really, really fortunate to help manage in the ways that I can. So thanks very much for your time.
Well, that was fantastic. I want to thank both Mark and Allysia for doing this for us. I learned a lot and wanted to see if anybody has any questions. Looking in the chat box. Anyone? Mark, I have a question for you about the simulations and what I think you had a note on yours that it's a good quality simulation is critical. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think makes a good simulation? I mean, I know from the transmission lines over the James River, the project itself ended up looking nothing like the simulation, and that was a really bone of contention for us, for those of us who've been opposed to the project. But I'm wondering if what's come out of that has led us to a better understanding of what a good simulation requires.
Sure. Yeah, so the simulations are often a real challenge, just because they're often done very early in a project. Certainly the project can change. The James River one, they actually ended up fairly close to where they were, in the simulations as far as the layout. And the company that did those is a really good company, but the key is the simulations that are provided typically in a VIA in the document are very insufficient for an actual analysis. You really need to be looking at the original kind of high quality, large scale simulations, at least at the decision maker level, to be able to judge what those impacts might be. The other thing is that simulations they can never reproduce completely the human visual experience. The human visual experience is dynamic. It's always moving. So the key that we try to emphasize when we talk about reviewing simulations is a really good simulation is going to look like a really good photograph of the project when it's done. And so if it's not going to look like what it does actually in real life. And that actually is the case with James River. I mean, we saw some of the large scale simulations at the VRS conference a few months later. The vendor brought those, had them up, and yep, the photos that we took on our field exercise when we went out there, they look a lot like those simulations. But having been there, we know that project does not look like a simulation in the field. So that's a big difference. And it's one thing to kind of do the really good simulations, but you've got to be able to say what those limitations are. And that's what's often not revealed, is that it's often portrayed that this is what the project's going to look like. And that is not the case.
Thank you. Appreciate
and I'll make a good pitch. We actually just have hot off the presses, well, maybe in about 2 weeks, we actually have a simulation review guide that goes into very good detail on what you should be looking for in a high quality simulation. So
that's fantastic, because I think that is a huge piece that was missing, and people don't know I mean, when we were doing the James River project, you know, we didn't know what we needed to ask for. And so I think that'll be very helpful to a
Right.
lot of us who are
Good.
to lessen these impacts. Let's see, we have about 5 more minutes. Allysia, did you have any closing thoughts? I loved what you did, and I really appreciate that you took us through the entire project, and that I liked that it was a more of a basic project than very complicated, because it helped me understand the different steps, and I really appreciated seeing that.